It has been more than 1 year since Russia invaded Ukraine, setting into motion the largest air, sea, and ground assault in Europe since World War II. The conflict has claimed thousands of lives, displaced millions of people, and destabilized the region. The consequences of the conflict have been devastating for both countries and for the global economy. The economic impact of the war is reverberating worldwide, contributing to inflationary pressures and impeding the post-pandemic recovery. The war led to elevated energy prices and exacerbated food shortages in many regions. 300 billion euros of Russian central bank reserves are blocked in the EU, other G7 countries, and Australia. 70% of assets of the Russian banking system are under sanctions. Around 20 billion euros of assets of more than 1,500 sanctioned persons and entities have been frozen. The war has been raging with no end in sight. But how long can Russia keep up its military aggression against its neighbor? What are the costs of its invasion? The war started on February 24, 2022, when Russia launched a surprise attack on Ukraine with dozens of missile strikes on cities all over the country. Russian ground troops moved in quickly, and within a few weeks were in control of most of eastern and southern Ukraine, including Crimea, which Russia had annexed in 2014. Russia claimed that it was protecting the rights and interests of ethnic Russians and Russian speakers in Ukraine, who had been oppressed by the pro-Western government in Kyiv. Russia also accused Ukraine of being a puppet of NATO and the US, and of posing a threat to its national security and sovereignty. Ukraine denied these allegations and said that Russia was violating its territorial integrity and international law. Ukraine appealed for help from its allies and partners, especially from NATO and the EU, who condemned Russia's aggression and imposed sanctions on Moscow. The US also provided military aid and training to Ukraine, while other countries like Canada, Poland, Turkey, and South Africa offered various forms of support. Since Russia's unprovoked and unjustified invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the European Council has adopted 10 packages of sanctions against Russia, Belarus, and Iran. Russia's economy has suffered greatly from the war and the sanctions imposed by the US and the EU. The sanctions have cut off Russia's access to international financial markets, foreign exchange reserves, and some of its energy exports. The sanctions imposed by the EU and its partners on Russia's financial system reduce Russia's ability to finance the war. Most of the economic forecast made in early 2022 predicted an 8 to 10% annual contraction in the Russian GDP. However, according to the preliminary estimates released by Rosstat on the 20th of February 2023, the decline stood at 2.1%. High inventory levels of raw materials and foreign intermediate inputs, pre-stocked amid the pandemic-related supply chain disruptions, allowed many Russian companies to sustain production for some months. Despite the partial embargo against the purchase of Russian crude oil, export earnings remain strong as the directions of Russian exports have changed markedly, with increasing trade with China, India, and Turkey, albeit at a discounted oil price. Although the flow of natural gas to Europe has declined, its prices have risen significantly. Imports, meanwhile, fell sharply due to the sanctions, disconnection from the SWIFT system, importers' limited access to foreign currency, and other factors. All told, the current account surplus reached a record high level in 2022, almost doubling compared to 2021. Russia's economy may continue to shrink in 2023. Its GDP is forecast to decline by 2.5% in the worst-case scenario, OECD, or by 0.2% according to the World Bank. 300 billion euros of Russian central bank reserves are blocked, and 70% of assets of the Russian banking system are under sanctions. Around 20 billion euros of assets of more than 1,500 sanctioned persons and entities have been frozen. These include Vladimir Putin, Sergei Lavrov, Yevgeny Prigozhin, Viktor and Alexander Yanukovych, Russian State Duma members, National Security Council members, military staff and high-ranking officials, business people, propagandists, and oligarchs. The war in Ukraine has also affected the global economy through three main channels: financial sanctions, commodities prices, and supply chain disruptions. The sanctions on Russia have reduced global trade and investment flows, especially in Europe, which is Russia's largest trading partner. The war has also increased the uncertainty and risk aversion in global financial markets, leading to higher borrowing costs and lower asset values. The commodities prices have risen sharply as a result of the war, especially for oil, gas, base metals, and grains. This has increased the cost of production and consumption for many countries and sectors, and has contributed to higher inflation and lower growth. The supply chain disruptions have occurred as a result of the damage to physical infrastructure and transportation networks in Ukraine and Russia, as well as the diversion of resources and attention from other economic activities. This has reduced the availability and quality of goods and services for domestic and foreign markets. Despite international pressure and diplomatic efforts, the war has not stopped. Instead, it has become more intense and complex, with frequent clashes along multiple front lines, missile attacks on civilian targets, cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, propaganda campaigns, and covert operations. Russia has deployed more than 200,000 troops in Ukraine, along with tanks, artillery, rockets, drones, and air defense systems. It has also used its naval and air forces to strike Ukrainian positions and assets. Russia has also hired thousands of mercenaries from the Wagner Group, a private military company linked to President Vladimir Putin. Ukraine has mobilized more than 300,000 troops to defend its territory, along with volunteers and paramilitary groups. It has also received weapons and equipment from various sources, including anti-tank missiles from the US, drones from Turkey, radars from Canada, and artillery from Poland. Ukraine has also relied on its own defense industry to produce new weapons and upgrade old ones. The war has taken a heavy toll on both sides. According to official sources, more than 40,000 people have been killed in the conflict, including soldiers and civilians. More than 4 million people have been displaced or affected by the war. The economic damage is estimated at hundreds of billions of dollars. The conflict has certainly reshaped the world order, as the United States, NATO, China, and other powers have been drawn into the crisis. The future prospects of the war depend on several factors, such as the motivation and resilience of both sides, the availability and effectiveness of weapons and equipment, the diplomatic and economic pressure from the international community, and the potential for dialogue and compromise. Here are some possible scenarios for how the war could evolve in 2023. A frozen conflict. The war reaches a stalemate, as neither side is able to achieve a decisive breakthrough on the ground. The front lines stabilize along the Dnieper River, with Russia controlling most of the Donbas region and Crimea, and Ukraine holding on to its western and central territories. The fighting continues sporadically, but at a lower intensity. The international community tries to broker a peace deal, but the negotiations are hampered by mutual distrust and divergent interests. The sanctions on Russia remain in place, but are not enough to force Putin to withdraw his troops or recognize Ukraine's sovereignty. The humanitarian situation in the occupied areas deteriorates as the population suffers from shortages of food, water, medicine, and electricity. A hot war. The war escalates into a full-scale confrontation as Russia launches a new offensive in the upcoming months, aiming to capture more territory and secure its supply lines to Crimea. Ukraine responds with fierce resistance, using its advanced Western weapons and equipment to inflict heavy losses on the Russian forces. The United States and NATO increase their military support to Ukraine, providing more arms, training, and intelligence. China takes advantage of the situation to expand its influence in Asia and Africa, challenging the US-led order. The risk of a nuclear exchange or a cyber attack rises as both sides resort to desperate measures to gain an edge. A post-Putin settlement. The war ends with a dramatic change in Russia's leadership as Putin is ousted by a coup. His successor is more pragmatic and willing to negotiate with Ukraine and the West. A peace agreement is reached based on the principles of territorial integrity, sovereignty, and security for both countries. Russia withdraws its troops from Ukraine's territory and recognizes its right to join NATO and the EU. Ukraine grants autonomy and amnesty to the separatists in Donbass and Crimea. The international community lifts the sanctions on Russia and provides economic aid and reconstruction assistance to both countries. A revised European security architecture. The war leads to a fundamental rethink of Europe's security arrangements, as both sides realize that they cannot afford to continue fighting indefinitely. A new framework is established, based on cooperation rather than confrontation. Russia agrees to respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, but also demands guarantees that it will not join NATO or host foreign military bases. Ukraine agrees to maintain a neutral status and pursue dialogue with Russia on various issues of common interest. The EU and NATO play a constructive role in facilitating the dialogue and providing security guarantees to both countries. Unfortunately, the war shows no signs of abating anytime soon. Both sides have entrenched their positions and have little incentive to compromise or negotiate. Russia wants to keep its influence and leverage over Ukraine and prevent it from joining NATO or the EU. Ukraine wants to restore its sovereignty and territorial integrity and pursue its Euro-Atlantic integration. The outcome of the war is uncertain and unpredictable. However, one thing is clear: the longer it lasts, the more damage it will cause to both countries and their people, as well as to regional and global security and stability. Therefore, it is in everyone's interest to find a peaceful solution that respects international law and human dignity. The war in Ukraine is not only a human tragedy, but also an economic disaster for both countries involved and for the world as a whole. The longer the war lasts, the greater the economic damage will be. The only way to end this vicious cycle is to stop the fighting and to start a peaceful dialogue that respects Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity.